We take a breath and recognize the word freedom and how that feels with us. And that quiet took 3 minutes. And we know from research that just that 3 minutes changes everything in our system. Our dopamine levels go up and our cortisol levels go down. We become more connected and our body responds in kind. Taking responsibility for my life leads to freedom. There are a lot of people that tell me every day that this 3 minutes is too hard to come by, and yet 3 minutes is our responsibility. Each life has its share of ups and downs. Like most people, we have felt blessed by our happy experiences and laid low by more difficult ones. We have used the spiritual tools of forgiveness and gratitude to learn from and move beyond our more painful experiences. This kind of spiritual housekeeping is our key to lasting freedom. By releasing blame and regret over and over again, if necessary, we are ensuring that we will not be bound by the past and limited by an outworn image of ourselves. Life is dynamic, and so are we. Our growth is dependent upon our movement forward, our willingness to do things like spend 3 minutes of quiet and commit to embracing the freedom that comes from leaving the rest behind and know that it is the now that we are a part of. With gratitude, we bless the person we were, and we are grateful for the people we are. With faith, we reach unencumbered for the person that we continue to become. Galatians 5:13, for you were called to freedom. Each of us are called to freedom. Taking responsibility for our lives leads us to freedom. All right. So today, I know our word was freedom and responsibility for the freedom. I think, and part of that responsibility is recognizing our ability or our need for compassion. I want to share with you, believe it or not, there's been all kinds of studies on compassion. Go figure, right? Especially in the medical field. So there is a book out called Compassionomics. Now I might butcher these lovely doctors' names, but one is Stephen Trusak and Anthony Mazzoli. They are the ones that compiled the book. I'm going to share with you some of their research today and what they share with the healthcare professionals about compassion, which I think we can take into our lives, you know, because what they decided was, well, first Anthony was charged with taking his center, the research center and hospital and learning center, and you know, when they have HR things that they like, well, you have to do this and you have to do that. And they were working on being nice and compassion. And he's like, well, how do I convince a bunch of people that are like super good at their job and workaholics and all of this, that this thing is also needed and worth their time? So he went to a colleague of his, Stephen Trusak, and he went to him because he was the research guru. You know, if it had data, he was more apt to believe that it had to be something that was done. So he asked them to help him find the data. And between the two of them, and they're not just the data, but the life experience, it's amazing what they've come up with. They started with a study that was done in 2007. Actually, the event happened in 2007. There was a bus collision in Sweden and 2 passenger buses collided, and it was just like awfulness. So many people are sent to the hospital. They're in 3 different hospitals. Several people die from that accident. 5 years later, somebody thought to go ask every single one of those people what they remembered about being in that accident 5 years later. The things they remembered was 1, the pain that they had, and 2, the lack of compassion from the hospitals. Those are the things they remembered. Now, they said they can't even say that it was just 1 hospital because these people were spread over 3 hospitals. And those were their 2 top answers. The pain, they remembered the pain, and they remembered the lack of compassion. So I know sometimes we're like, oh, if we just smile at somebody and we offer empathy and compassion, then that's what they take with us. But I wonder if it's not just the opposite. They remember when the icky feeling happens more than the happy feeling. What they found through their research and was that sometimes 56% of physicians believe they didn't have time to share compassion. And that was a Princeton study. I forgot to write down the year, but there was a Princeton study that said 56% of physicians believe they just didn't have time. So they started doing other experiments of what would happen if we showed them they did have time. What would happen? Or what would happen if we just laid a couple of these things out for them and showed them? And what they were able to come up with, and I won't go through because the book is quite extensive, but over many different diseases, right, and many different circumstances, if these tiny little steps were taken, not only did they feel like they were being heard, right, the people in these situations, but their health improved and costs went down because not as many tests were being done. You weren't shuffled around from doctor to doctor, and not as many people were going to the emergency room. One particular set of data that I found really interesting is sometimes there are some hospitals that deal with homeless coming in and saying there's something wrong with them and they have to deal with them in the emergency room, right? And sometimes, and what they did was they took, I forget, it was like 125 of homeless people that they knew were in the hospital at like an average of 6 to 7 times a year. They would get into the emergency room system in one way or the other. They decided that they were going to have people, they weren't even the doctors and the nurses that were taking care of them, just, they taught random people how to go in and spend 3 to 5 minutes with these people in a compassion, like just talk to them. They didn't even ask them why they were there a lot of times. It was just about life or about the weather, whatever. We were just talking, offering that human contact. And what they found was the incidences of those people returning to the emergency room went way down from like 7 to maybe 1 or nothing from the same group of people. So offering a little bit of compassion was what they needed to feel better to begin with, human contact. Now imagine that if you don't have people coming in that can't pay for emergency room services that really maybe not need it, well, that's saving a lot of money right there. So they're saying offering compassion is not only time worthy, but it's economically worthy, especially in these circumstances. Again, you need data in order to sometimes change people's viewpoints. And this is one of the reasons they really looked at economics, was that if you take how much is involved in the US healthcare system, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. Imagine that, just our healthcare system is the 5th largest economy in the world. So they looked at numbers like that to get their point across. That I can't even fathom that myself. That's how much our healthcare system is running on. They found that when they taught these physicians, and what they did, the major study they did was with cancer patients at Johns Hopkins. So if you were sent to an oncologist for a consultation, right? They gave the oncologist a script, an actual script to read when they first came in and how to close up the conversation. The script took 40 seconds, they timed it. So these physicians that said they didn't have time to offer some kind of extra support in these circumstances, the script they gave them was 40 seconds. And in the script, I didn't write the whole script for you, but in the script, in the beginning, it was, we're going to work through this together. I'm hearing you. This, know that this is a group effort, right? And before they left, they reiterated that they were allowed to call with any questions, that they were their teammates in the decision-making process. That was the bit of compassion. In studying this, there was a lot, they studied the anxiety level. So the anxiety levels of these people dealing with a diagnosis of cancer started to go way down from where it was because they added 40 seconds of a script to the doctors that were taking care of these people on their initial visit. Now, we all know that if your anxiety goes down, your body works better healing and working with itself, no matter what treatment is involved. Stress, it counteracts the stress. They also found through other studies that the healthcare providers and the doctors that were offering this compassion, their stress levels went down. Burnout levels went down. The common thing we hear is, even when we are on burnout level, right, is to go take yourself to the beach and forget everybody and just, do a nothing. And one of the authors of this book, Stephen, he said he was definitely in burnout. He's a ICU doctor, intensive care. So he sees the worst of the worst. And he said he knew he had hit burnout, but he decided to take his own research into consideration. And instead of taking himself totally off the charts and walking out the door, like, conventional wisdom would say, he said, I'm gonna recognize what I've studied, and I'm going to recognize compassion in these moments instead of just the job and just what I have to do. And it switched him around. And what they found, now he said, obviously he was the test subject of one, right? But they were able to expand that into other studies. And when we choose a compassionate route, we actually turn on the happy things in our brain, right? And compassion, they labeled compassion as empathy plus action. So we feel with the other person, we understand what the other person is going through, we let ourselves feel that, which can be painful, right? But then we act on it. The action is the compassion part, whether we're acting through presence or words or errand running or whatever the compassion component is, the action component is. That not only brings forth a lessening of anxiety response in the person we're compassionate with, it has positive effects on ourselves, measurable ones in brain chemistry. So compassion isn't some far off, well, the guru said we have to do it, right? And if we're struggling with that, and I like what these doctors said, because they said, we struggle with this because we're in it all the time, right? And it's really hard to sometimes recognize 40 seconds of even a script that maybe we're not totally feeling, but we know is necessary in that moment. And yet, it's not just the right thing to do. Our bodies and the data says it's a must do for all of us. And that connection between each other is what helps lead it on, because the action is between people, right? It's a people to people action. That's what compassion is, people to people. They did a study at Harvard, and the study lasted over 80 years. I forget when it first started, but it's lasted over 80 years. And they took young college students and young men that were not college students, because at the time Harvard only had male college students, so it's a male study, but that's how it was at that time. And they found that whether they were a college student or not, whether they had college education or not, by the time they reached age 50, the biggest click to say whether they would be happy and healthy at age 80 was the strength and the recognition of their interpersonal relationships, how they interacted and with friends, with family, with loved ones, with neighbors. If they had satisfactory relationships, if they felt compassion and felt compassion towards their neighbors, that was the biggest clicker mark on whether at 50 years old, whether they would be happy and healthy at 80. Interpersonal reactions. Empathy plus action. They mentioned in their book that we are in a compassion crisis right now, and they have lots of data to support that conclusion. But the biggest one was that the uptick in the amount of studies in compassion across the board, you know, psychologists, sociologists, religious people, you know, the amount of studying of just this word and this topic has risen a ton. If you look at the graph, it just keeps going up and up and up. And their point was, we don't study things if we don't think there's a problem. Isn't that the truth? We don't try to figure out a way to fix it if we don't think there's a problem. And to fix it, you know, sometimes we need data in order to convince other people that it's something that's worthy of being fixed. I don't know, I know this is all a clinical kind of talk, but I think it's great that somebody thought of actually gathering data on something as what we would think would be as simple as compassion, and to know that that click that they started with the doctors was 40 seconds. 40 seconds. They actually had a picture that a young patient had drawn her doctor, right? And what she had drawn was her on the exam table and her mom and her sisters on the side, and the doctor facing away from her on the computer. And he's like, I can't believe that's what she's taking away from the experience with the doctor looking at the computer. And I said, I have to agree, because last summer, I took my youngest, the two boys, for their checkup and their booster shots, you know, all those things you're supposed to do, right? And it's the first, because we don't go to the doctors much, because they usually have not been very, very ill. It's not it's not something we need to do. So we go on the have to well checks. And this is the first time. So the last well check might have been 2 or 3 years ago, because wherever the booster schedule is. The last time we were there was the doctor that had been with me since my oldest was a baby. So he had retired. And I was like, well, what's going on now? Well, he's allowed to retire, you know, but it was like a big shock. Now the nurses that we were used to were still there, but the whole system had changed. And I don't know that it was that doctor was any less of a nice person than the doctor I was used to. But there was a great amount of time on the computer, a lot of time on the computer, very little time actually talking to the boys, or even, you know, touching their glands, all the stuff you think you were used to that they would do. They wouldn't even touch them without checking the computer first. And I went away with that image. So it was interesting that in this book, they referred to an image just like that. Because there was no hearing of anything. You know, there was only what was the check marks, what was necessary on the computer, and you know, even from a nurse that we were very used to that had been giving them injections since they were itty bitty, you know, that had never acted that way before. So I know that's part of some new training, I don't know, right? But then there's this book that's really recent that's trying to change all that in the middle of it. And I don't think it's just the doctor's offices. I think as a society, we've kind of gotten away. There's this idea of stay in your own path and just don't look and have the horse blinders on, and we'll all be okay some way. You know, in the interpersonal just being. And I know it's hard. You guys know it's hard for me, you know, the whole thing with extra people and everything. And yet to just listen and look somebody in the eye and spend, my goodness, 40 seconds or the 3 minutes that we spent with ourselves at the beginning of today. Things turn around with that. Things turn around. People are healthier. They have data. People are healthier. This is Mental Health Awareness Month. You know, and if we can change that chemistry of the brain and people feel like they are actually okay to be with each other, just as a human, empathy plus action equals compassion. Thank you.